Hey everyone, and welcome to another SkillCapped guide. In this video, we're going to be reviewing wrist aiming and arm aiming. These are the two different styles that you can maneuver your mouse, and they each have their different pros and cons. Determining which style is the best for you to use is crucial to optimizing your aim. We're going to go over what wrist aiming and arm aiming are, discuss the benefits and negatives of each, as well as discuss other external factors that play a big impact on whether you should be an arm aimer or wrist aimer. And if you're serious about improving, then go to SkillCapped.com to unlock our hyper improvement system that will teach you how to win more gunfights, master your agent, and so much more. Backed by our rank improvement guarantee, you have nothing to lose. So come join over 500,000 satisfied members of SkillCapped, improve your KDA, and get the rank you've always wanted at SkillCapped.com. Link in the description below. Enough for the hype though, let's jump right into it. Alright, first up, we're going to review what wrist aiming is. Wrist aiming tends to be the most common and most natural way that people aim. With wrist aiming, you usually have your wrist resting on the edge of the table while the rest of your arm is floating off the table. This position puts you in a tendency of only using your wrist to move your mouse and aim. Players who are wrist aimers will tend to play with a very high sensitivity. To give you some numbers on what a high sensitivity may be, anything above an EDPI of 450 is considered to be pretty high, and it's reasonable to assume that most wrist aimers are well above this. To calculate your EDPI, simply multiply your DPI by your in-game sensitivity. The reason that these players use a high sensitivity is because they need to use their wrist for both precise small aim adjustments, but also for larger aim adjustments, as well as mouse swipes for potential ability usage or rotations. In order to achieve all of these with just the movement of the wrist, you need a high sensitivity so that your wrist can do both micro and macro tweaks to your aim along with movement in general. The most popular pro player who uses arm aiming is Hiko from Pro Team 100 Thieves. As of the making of this video, he uses a DPI of 1600 and a sensitivity of 0.36. If we calculate the EDPI out of that, we get a value of 576, which is well above the value that we set for people to be in the high sensitivity category. We're going to talk about the pros and cons in just a moment with wrist aiming as well as arm aiming, but first let's identify what arm aiming is so we have a better visual idea of what the two aiming styles look like. As the name suggests, an arm aimer is one that tends to use their wrist to aim, but they also use their elbow and shoulder together as well as necessary. They tend to have their whole forearm on the table along with their wrist to help increase their control. With the entire arm involved, you get much more options on which joints and muscle groups you want to utilize for different movements. If you only need to make a small aim adjustment, then you would just use your wrist to do so. If you need to make a medium or larger aim adjustment, then you would still use your wrist, but you supplement your wrist with your elbow or shoulder and create a mouse glide that covers a much greater distance. Because you're using your entire arm in a larger variety of smaller and bigger muscle groups, you're then able to use a much lower sensitivity. Players who are arm aimers will tend to have a DPI that is below the 450 threshold like we mentioned earlier. To give you some examples, as of writing this video, two of the most popular Valorant players, Liquid Mendo and T1 Brax, are arm aimers and use an EDPI of 247.5 and 136. This sensitivity is much lower than what we saw a wrist aimer like Hiko use, but these values are actually much closer to average than you'd see the professional players being at, while Hiko's EDPI is much less common. With the basics being said, before we get into the benefits and disadvantages, it's important to note that these are just estimated ranges, and depending on how high or low you may fall within the 450 benchmark, players could end up wrist aiming below 450 or arm aiming above 450. Around that number, there's really options for both, and it really depends on what feels most comfortable and natural to the player. For example, pro player Liquid Scream has an EDPI of 306 as of making this video, and he primarily still aims with his wrists. Now that we know what both of these aiming styles are, let's first discuss the pros and cons of wrist aiming. The pros of being a wrist aimer is that you really only need to be worried about using one part of your arm when aiming. If you're a player that doesn't have very good coordination and really is only able to isolate one part like your wrist for example, then being a wrist aimer will be extremely beneficial for you. Along with that, regardless of what sensitivity a player ends up using, you're going to be using your wrist the majority of the time for your aim. This is because for a game like Valorant, precision is key and the wrist really allows you to make those fine-tuned movements to ensure that your aim is nice and crispy. Lastly, if you're short on space on your desk or table, or you have a small sized mouse pad, aiming with the wrist is perfect for allowing you to aim the best you can with the equipment that you have. Not everyone has room to widely swipe their mouse across their desk or mouse pad to hit the flick shots. With that being said, there are two big cons with being a wrist aimer though. The first is that it puts a lot of stress on the wrists. With only using the wrist, you're relying on a very small joint, which again only has a limited amount of motion. As mentioned before, this usually leads to players upping their sensitivity so that they can still move their aim short distances, but also being able to move it long distances as well. But with the limited motion of wrist resulting in you having to up your sensitivity, the difference between wrist movement for a small aim adjustment and a big aim adjustment is mere centimeters. It's extremely difficult to tell your wrist to move just that touch more to get a big adjustment and to back off just a touch for those small adjustments. This is why having a high sensitivity tends to be much more difficult to control for players. Along with that, being a wrist aimer has some health disadvantages as well. While there hasn't been any Valorant players that have reported wrist issues yet, there have been wrist aimers in the past from other games that ended up with these problems. A few examples include pro Counter-Strike player Shox and Fortnite player Zexro, in which Zexro in particular ended up with tendinitis just prior to the World Cup tournament. By relying solely on your wrist, which composes of very small muscles and has very little range of motion, you can become susceptible to these kinds of injuries. Especially if you are new to the FPS genre and just immediately started grinding the hours and wrist aiming entirely, your muscles are likely not used to this increased load and activity, which can also make you susceptible to those injuries. Moving on, let's talk about the pros of using arm aiming. First up, with arm aiming, you can use much lower sensitivities than with wrist aiming. Because you have more range of motion by including the elbow and shoulder, you will still be able to hit all the areas that you want. If the enemy is close by, use just the wrist to aim. If you need a mid-range flick, you can still use the wrist but add a little bit of elbow. If you need a far range adjustment, use your entire arm and make a big glide across your mouse pad to achieve it. You don't have this option with wrist aiming, and it's very clear what you need to do in order to make each specific movement. Again, unlike the wrist, where the difference is determined by mere centimeters, arm aiming is crystal clear on what each movement looks like. This then makes it much easier for you to do the specific movement you need. Another pro is that arm aiming is just much healthier on the joints. Instead of relying solely on the wrist, which we mentioned is a small joint made of small muscles, arm aiming allows you to bring in those bigger forearm and shoulder muscles. These muscles are much stronger and less susceptible to fatigue, thus allowing you to maintain that crispy aim for hours on end. And because they're being utilized together, the wrist ends up taking less of the load, thus allowing you to keep it healthy and injury free. One con to arm aiming is that it's very unnatural to people though. Most people jump right into aiming solely from the wrist, and trying to include the arm is very foreign to them. While some players eventually get used to it, others just don't feel comfortable arm aiming no matter how hard they try. Especially if you've been aiming with the wrist for years on end, trying to change these old habits can be extremely hard. The second con is that arm aiming requires a lot of space. If you don't have a big desk or you don't have a big mouse pad, you won't be able to do arm aiming, as you're likely going to end up swiping past the mouse pad or hitting your keyboard or any other objects that are on the table. Now that we've discussed the pros and cons, which way of aiming is the best to do? The answer to that is it depends. You're going to need to take into consideration all the pros and cons of each that we just mentioned and compare it to the specific situation and setup that you have to identify which aiming style is the right one for you. On paper, arm aiming appears to be the superior aiming style. You can use lower sensitivities to be more accurate, it's healthier for you, and you can better differentiate specific movements you have to do to adjust your aim different distances. I personally was originally a wrist aimer for years until I had seen a pro Counter-Strike player using their entire arm to aim, which intrigued me. Like I said, it was very awkward at first, but I quickly noticed that once I got used to it, I was able to play on lower sensitivities, which greatly improved my aim. Plus, up to this point, I've never had any wrist issues. This versus another friend I played Counter-Strike with who used a very high sensitivity and solely used his wrist. While our aim was pretty similar, with me just being a touch better, he ended up developing wrist issues, and there was a time where he had to actually take a break from FPS games for months to allow it to heal. However, it's important to note that this is just my experience, meaning the sample size is just one. When looking at the pros, they're actually quite split between the two styles. Some of them are wrist aimers, and then others are arm aimers. By looking at this larger pool of data, no one style really comes out on top. While most of the community are likely wrist aimers, I highly suggest that you try arm aiming out if you have the space for it for all the pros that we mentioned earlier. While arm aiming implies that you're going to use your entire arm more, you're still going to be using solely the wrist most of the time for those minor aim adjustments that you'll most be doing in Valorant. However, adding just a bit of the elbow or shoulder can greatly decrease the stress of the wrist while still achieving the same results. But again, arm aiming may just end up uncomfortable and resulting in you performing considerably worse because of this. If this is the case, you're likely better off sticking with wrist aiming, and with the right EDPI and practice, you can still precisely achieve the movements that you want. This is likely a big reason many of the pros are still wrist aimers, plus when pros are playing in LAN tournaments, the space they get is quite limited, so they may not be able to make those large mouse swipes without hitting something. So rather than risking having to deal with that, they use a sensitivity that they're comfortable with, and that will work regardless of what LAN environment they're in. And if you do ease your way into wrist aiming and take breaks, the risk of injury is quite minimal. And remember, if you want to improve, win more gunfights, and get the rank you've always wanted, then check out SkillCapped.com, link in the description below. Alright, so which way of aiming are you currently doing? Let us know in the comment section below. And while you're down there, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to get more premium guides just like this one with one goal in mind: helping you become a better player. We here at SkillCapped want to thank you for watching. We'll catch you in the next. I'm Dr. Zora, and good luck out there.